right, so evidence for evolution has been gathered since Darwin's time. So we're going to be looking at 5 different lines of evidence, and a couple of these were being gathered at the time of Darwin, and some of those have been discovered since Darwin. But the evidence is overwhelming. We continue to find more and more and more evidence to support it. I like to open with this picture for the evidence just because it's such a cool little story. This specific pygmy seahorse was so well camouflaged that the first specimens of them were only discovered because the coral that they live on was collected and brought back to the lab. So the divers collected the coral that these guys were attached to, brought it back to the lab, put it in an aquarium, and then after a little while, one of these little guys detached and started swimming around. Nobody knew that they had even existed up until that point. So there's lots of support for evolution, not just the evidence-wise, but from different parts of, the world, I guess you could say. So it's not just science, but other areas of study as well. So, all right. So here are our 5 lines of evidence, and we're going to take a look at each of these, what they are and what kind of information we've got for each of them. So we're going to start with the fossil record. That one makes sense. We have stuff we saw, things with like Darwin and so forth. We're going to talk about biogeography, so locations around the world with organisms. We're going to look at anatomy and embryology, so early development. Molecular biology. This one was definitely not around during Darwin's time, but this one's a new field that's continuing to support the theory of evolution, and then laboratory and field experiments. So let's start off with fossil record. So the fossil record is a document in rock, basically, of the process of natural selection. So it is documented back through time. Now, we've used it a lot, however, it is incomplete. You've probably heard of things like the missing links and things like that. The problem with the fossil record is not everything gets fossilized. The squishier an organism is, the less likely it is to get fossilized. So a lot of what we have as far as fossils go are things that had bones or shells. Even the ones that we do have, we don't necessarily have all of the, full idea of what the organism looked like. So think about like in, a million years, if we're no longer here and aliens land and they find our, skeleton fossils, they're going to have a hard time figuring out what we look like because all they're going to have is our skeleton, right? They're going to not have things like our muscles, our skin, our hair. It's going to be much more difficult to really figure out what a human looked like when all you have left is a fossilized skeleton. And that's what we have for these organisms. We don't often have things like snapshots of their fur and so forth. This one right here that's being prepared, this is actually a very good version of a fossil. This is Archaeopteryx. And if you look at it and kind of use your imagination a little bit, you can see the feathers. This is a feathered dinosaur. So these are feathers, so we have a decent idea of what this one looked like. It had feathers all along its tail and wings. It even had it along its legs. That's actually what they're preparing over on this other side, is parts of an Archaeopteryx that are not in anywhere near as good of shape. This one's much more jumbled, and that's the thing, is that a lot of what we are finding are fossils that are not in, nice, perfectly laid out versions of the organism. So we are missing a lot of the different parts of organisms, and the only place that we might get those soft, squishy parts are things like resin, so amber. So you may have seen pictures of things like insects and so forth in amber, and then very deep bottoms of deep lakes, or permafrost. So we've been getting some mammoths and woolly rhinos that are melting out of the permafrost and things like Siberia. So that is one problem we have, is that we don't have everything. The one thing that we can do with what we call radiometric dating, we can measure the amount of what we call isotopes. So there are different compounds that are radioactive and they break down at a very specific rate. So in the rocks of the planet, there is uranium-238, which is radioactive. It has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. And so this is part of how we determined that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. But we can also use that uranium to date the rocks that the fossils are in. So that uranium will break down at a specific rate from when it was laid down, and we can figure out when those rocks were put down that the fossils are in. And we can also do some other math as far as, you know, the rock layers and so forth above and below, but we can get you know, their ages. Now we're not getting like specific, you know, ages. They are our range, but what that allows us to do is do things like build evolutionary trees of different groups. So this is actually the history that's most well preserved in the fossil record, and that's the evolutionary tree of horses. So they first showed up in North America about 55 million years ago, and these are the ones that we have discovered. We see different adaptations showing up throughout the branches, but the only one that is alive today is our modern horse. So we can use these fossils and the radiometric data to be able to build, you know, evolutionary trees to show relationships. The other thing that we use our fossil record for is to look for those transitions from one place to another. For example, this is the transition between fish, so water, to land. So these are the early amphibians. This is one of the, quote, missing links. There are actually more than just Tiktaalik. So this is Tiktaalik. There are actually other fossils that go now in between here and here. But Tiktaalik was huge because it's very much the fossil that's right in the middle of these guys. So if you look here at its limb, lobe-fin fishes, which are actually still in existence today, but we also have fossilized ones, have arms, right, have limbs. And you can see they have this pattern of one kind of like upper bone, and then a lower kind of arm, and then a wrist with some maybe fingers. And we see the same patterns as we go from Tiktaalik to the amphibians. They're just getting more complicated and arranging so that they're more able to walk on them as we get to the amphibians. And this one, Tiktaalik, is very much in between the two. That's not the only characteristic that Tiktaalik has in between these two. You can see that the eyes on Tiktaalik are on top, just like they are on an amphibian, instead of being on the side of the head like on a fish. Tiktaalik had a neck, so it could turn its head. Think about a fish. A fish, if it turns its head, its whole body turns. But Tiktaalik had scales like a fish. It also had, you know, it still has a very much fish-type body, but also an amphibian-type body. So it is an in-between of these two animals. All right, so that's the fossil record. So we've got the fossil record, but it can only get us so far. Biogeography. So biogeography, this is the geographic patterns of species, distributions, either in a specific area or around the planet. So I'm going to show you one for a specific area. So this is like Darwin's finches. It's the same idea of Ecuador to the Galapagos Islands. Only in this instance, we're going from North America, one of these little mainland finches. You've probably seen something like this around in Ohio, to Hawaii. Now, this is a little bit farther trip. We're talking 2,000 miles away, but they're birds. It could happen. They could get blown onto, a raft of trees or something like that, and then, get blown out there and fly the rest of the way. Same sort of thing, though, happened when they got to the Hawaiian Islands. We get a huge variety of, instead of what we call finches, they call honey creepers. So honey creepers have fairly similar body types, but same sort of idea as far as the bills. The bills are very, very different, but some of the coloring is different as well. They're found at different habitats. So you can see wet forests versus specific slopes. Some of these are only found on one island on one side. As you can see, this is very specific. And their diets are very different from each other. And so this is an idea, this idea of biogeography, that these guys located and then spread out and distributed themselves into new species over time. And that can give us ideas on how that worked. So, seeing that pattern of how they changed as they moved through the islands, how their habitat is reflected in the changes to the organism. Same thing with the finches. Another example of biogeography is the Australian marsupials versus the North American placental organisms. Well, North and South American, because we've got a South American one on here. But Australia is the only place on the planet that pretty much all of their mammals are marsupials, meaning that they have pouches for their young. We, in the North American area, for North America, we only have one, which is the opossum. South America has a couple, but a majority of our mammals are what we call placental, meaning that they have their babies like we do, like humans. So what we've got here are some examples of biogeography at play. So if we take a look, what do you notice about, say, for example, the sugar glider and the flying squirrel? Yeah, you probably noticed that they both have these long kind of flat tails. They both have the webs right here. They both have the little cute faces. And you may not have realized it, but they are on black backgrounds because they're both nocturnal. All right. These organisms look very similar to each other for a reason. Same thing for the anteater and the numbat. So they don't look identical, but they both have these long noses. If we could see it better at their feet, they both have digging feet. They have these long, bushy type tails. The Tasmanian wolf, which actually no longer exists, but it's the counterpart to the gray wolf here in North America. But they both look wolfy. I guess is the best description. It's just that the gray wolf is more furry, more poofy, but they have the same sort of general body layout. If we looked at their teeth would be very similar. And this is because even though they're found on different parts of the planet, right? So these guys are in North and South America. These guys are in Australia. They're also different groups of organisms. So they're mammals, but they're not closely related to each other. they still end up with a lot of characteristics in common because they have similar habitats. And so this is another way we can look at biogeography. Do you have, in similar habitats, do you have organisms that are showing up with similar characteristics to deal with those issues, right? So these guys are gliding around in trees to eat things like fruits and berries and nuts. These guys are both eating insects. These guys are both carnivores, right? So that's biogeography.